I'm just gonna say it like it is. Zani is an absolute disaster. I've been incredibly vocal of my dislike of how Zani as a character is designed, and that's not gonna stop anytime soon. But I feel like I should clue everyone in on what exactly feels so wrong about this character to me. First, I do want to talk a bit about the things I do like about Zani, because every time I talk negatively about a character, I want to make it known that I don't despise the character with my entire being. I do enjoy some aspects of the character, so that's what I want to talk about first when it comes to Zani. So what are the things I like about Zani's kit? Well, first of all, I think one of the best things about Zani is her sound design. It single-handedly got me to pull the character, even though my Phoebe would never be paired up with her since she is S6 and thus she is a DPS. Her sound design is so incredibly good, and I absolutely love it. It's by far my favorite part about the character. I also think that, to this day, Zani has the best splash art in the entire game. She just farms an obscene amount of aura, and I love that about her. But now it's time to get into the actual topic of the video, being why I believe Zani absolutely fails as a character. First of all, I think this one's pretty obvious. Zani is tied to the hip with Phoebe, and if you do not have Phoebe, this character feels like a genuine brick. She is so bad without Phoebe that she actually ends up becoming worse than 1.0 characters. And not just any 1.0 characters, I'm talking about the very bottom of the barrel. And it's not just characters like Sheng Liao, it's also 1.0 teams like GN Mortefi or even Encore Sanhua. Zani's damage output drops by a genuinely abhorrent amount without Phoebe, and this is for a lot of reasons. And because it is for a lot of reasons, that also means it's insanely hard to actually fix this issue. First of all, the fact that her heavy attacks count as spectrophrasal damage. I think not enough people realize just how big of an issue this is. Because it's not just that you're able to double dip on some buffs by buffing both heavy and frazzle, it's also that the frazzle buffs are so much stronger than regular attack or heavy buffs, it's genuinely insane. Look no further than comparing Yuno's Ultra skill to Phoebe's Ultra skill. Yuno gives 50% damage amplification to heavy attacks. Okay, cool. Phoebe's gives double the damage amplification, it also works on Zani's enhanced skill and her Ultra skill, and also has 10% Res Red, which is one of the strongest ways to buff your team's damage. Buffs to negative status are simply inherently stronger than those to regular damage, because the damage of negative status, on its own, is just a lot lower than that of your character. Spectrofrazzle is never going to match up to the damage of a Phoebe or a Jinshi, but by making Zani's damage count as Spectrofrazzle, she is able to benefit from these ludicrously overinflated buffs. And thus, in order to make her balanced, they had to make her weaker at a baseline. And because they made her weaker at a baseline, she ends up feeling really weak without these specific Spectrofrazzle buffs. But if that was the only reason that Zani really needed Phoebe, it wouldn't be that big of an issue to fix. We just need more Spectrofrazzle buffers. But there's more to this issue. So the next thing to talk about would be the fact that Zani's rotation is heavily influenced by the amount of Spectrofrazzle application within your team. This is a really big deal that not enough people are talking about in my opinion. Zani converts Spectrofrazzle into Heliacal Embers, and when she converts Frazzle into a Heliacal Ember, she ends up getting Blaze, which is the forte bar that she uses during her ultimate. So the more Spectrofrazzle you apply, the more blazes you have up until a certain point. Now as you may imagine, the cap for these blazes is perfectly set to where with a Phoebe Shorekeeper team, you just barely cap out on blazes. Because that is the team Kuro intended you to play when it comes to Zani. However, what happens when you have less Spectrofrazzle application and thus you have less blazes? Well, your damage drops by even more, because technically, your combo doesn't change, but your combo not changing still doesn't mean your damage doesn't decrease. On Zani's Heavy/Nightfall, she consumes up to 40 additional blaze to increase the damage output of Nightfall. This is all nice and dandy, nothing inherently wrong with the system, except for the fact that Phoebe Shorekeeper gives you just enough blazes to actually consume 40 blaze each time you cast Nightfall, which is going to be twice. So if you have any amount of Spectrofrazzle application less, well, your second Nightfall is gonna end up feeling like a wet pool noodle, because you just have way less blazes that you're able to consume, thus drastically decreasing the damage of this ability that's already suffering from a lot of damage loss, because, well, you don't have the Phoebe buffs. So ultimately your damage loss is not just tied to having less buffs on your character, it's also tied to your Spectrofrazzle application. So it really isn't as simple as just making a character that has slightly less buffs than Phoebe giving you an actual alternative. They also need to apply enough frazzle, and at that point, we're making a character that already exists and her name is Phoebe. So that's never happening. I truly don't believe we're ever going to get a good alternative to use with Zani that isn't named Phoebe, because the only way you can make an alternative is just by making a second Phoebe. And, well, I don't know about you, but I don't see WuWa making a second Phoebe anytime soon. Oh, but don't worry, that's not the end of my rant. That's just the biggest issue I have with the character. Because the second thing I want to talk about in this video is that Zani's outro skill makes no sense. Now, okay, the damage part of the outro, that's completely fine. Doing a tick of 150% of attack that counts as frazzle damage, and gets stronger the more frazzles on the enemy, that makes perfect sense. In fact, that's great. However, why are we giving this thing 20% spectral damage amplification? Now, I understand where they might be coming from when we look at it from a logical perspective, because Spectral Rover does an actually pretty decent amount of damage, so buffing them is, you know, completely fine. Is what I would say if that is what Kuro wants us to run. Kuro sees the team as Phoebe Shorekeeper, not Phoebe and Spectral Rover. Because while we may know that Spectral Rover is better, that's definitely not what Kuro was planning. Which makes it all the more confusing that Zani's outro skill has a buff in it. Why does it have a buff? That doesn't make any sense. 20% spectral damage amplification can only be used by spectral characters, and not someone like Yuno, for example, so it's only benefiting spectral characters. But because the characters you chose for the team are Phoebe and Shorekeeper, what are you supposed to be amplifying here? Phoebe's 200,000 damage per rotation? Or Shorekeeper's 40,000? That's not... Why? Why is this a part of the kit? It doesn't need to be there. When you're designing a kit, the number one question you have to ask is, what do I want this character to accomplish? And, well, Kuro wanted Zani to be a selfish DPS. So why are we adding buffing to her kit when the team that you are intending for her to use doesn't have any other characters in it that have any sort of useful damage output? It doesn't make sense to me. With Cardathea, I can actually sort of see it, because you're using both Arrow Rover and Shikona, both of which actually have noticeable damage. But Phoebe's damage in Confession is really, really low, and Shorekeeper just doesn't really do any real damage. So Zani's outro skill having supportive aspects to it doesn't make sense, and it goes completely against what Kuro wanted her to be. But if you think this is the end of the video, you would still be wrong, because it's time to talk about a bit of an obscure thing about Zani's kit that you might not even know about. You know Zani's Heliacal Embers? They don't count as negative status. Yeah, Zani takes a negative status, which is Frazzle, and then turns it into not a negative status. If you want to know what it's classified as in the game's code, it is classified as a buff/debuff. It's not a negative status. Negative statuses are in fact hard-coded to be specifically Glacial Chafe, Spectral Frazzle, Fusion Burst, Havoc Bane, Error Erosion, and Electro Flare. Those are hard-coded to be the only negative statuses. Everything else does not count as a negative status. So why is this so bad? Well, it makes free-to-play weapons like the Legend of the Drunken Hero and certain Tile of Adversity and Whimpering Waste effects just not work on Zani, even though they are designed around Zani. Take the current Whimpering Waste as an example. It has a token that increases the damage dealt to enemies when they're inflicted with a negative status. But, whoopsie daisy, Zani doesn't use negative status because her Heliacal Ember isn't a negative status at all, and while her attacks might count as Spectrofrazzle damage, it still doesn't count as inflicting an enemy with negative status. You aren't even able to point towards her enhanced skill, which does apply a stack, because it specifically specifies that it only works with the Eternal Radiance set. Nothing else. Only Eternal Radiance. So that doesn't count as a negative status either. And because it doesn't count as a negative status, it has complete anti-synergy with other negative status characters that want to have negative status applied to the enemy. For example, if you wanted to play Zani and Phoebe dual carry, you can't, because Heliacal Ember is not the same as Spectrofrazzle, and thus, Phoebe is not able to get her 256% damage amplification, thus completely breaking this team archetype. Why? Because Kuro decided Zani gets to have some special treatment. I don't know, Cardothea didn't get her own version of Error Erosion. Why does Zani get her own Frazzle? I don't get it. It just removes freedom. But that's just my opinion on Zani. Let me know what you think of her in the comments down below. And while you're down there, be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. If you have any questions, be sure to check out my Discord server, which is linked in the description. If you just want to see more of me, you can check out my second channel, which is also linked in the description. I just don't really post that often. But that'll be all from me. Peace.